Right. Good evening, everybody. Let me just share my screen. I think probably Kate needs to turn hers off, and then I can then put mine on. Right. Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Nice to actually be speaking to you from not exactly Missouri, but just over the border in Kansas. So it's slightly bizarre sort of being almost in person, but not quite. At least it's rather better than me being beamed in from Bristol back in the UK. So at least I'm so in the right sort of time zone and everything else. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is looking at Tutankhamun's tomb in the way it fits into the broader scheme of Egyptian royal tombs. Tutankhamun's tomb is so well known that often people sort of rather think of it in isolation rather than how it fits into the broader scheme of Egyptian royal funerary matters. So that's basically where I'm going tonight. Now, of course, Egyptian burials go back thousands of years prior to Tutankhamun's day. Here we've got an example of one of the pre-dynastic burials, millennia earlier than Tutankhamun, and with the natural preservation, which Egyptologists have often argued is the basis for the development of artificial mummification and the whole rest of the panoply of Egyptian royal funerary arrangements. And then beyond that, again, millennia prior to Tutankhamun's day, we have the pyramids of Giza here from the 4th dynasty. And then a few centuries prior to Tutankhamun's day, the transfer of the Egyptian royal cemetery, for the time being at least, to Western Thebes, the western side of the river, opposite modern Luxor. And this is the basic layout of the necropolis. We've got the green fields of the cultivation at the bottom. Then along the edge of the cultivation are a whole series of memorial temples belonging to the various kings of the new kingdom. And then marked, highlighted here, we have the Valley of the Kings, in which the tombs of the various monarchs whose temples lie along the front of the necropolis were constructed. It's always important to recognize that every Egyptian tomb, at least for anybody who can afford it anyway, has two elements. There is the burial element, which in the case of the New Kingdom is in the Valley of the Kings, and then the public element, the place where people can make offerings to the cult of the dead king along the edge of the cultivation. And Tutankhamun will have had that arrangement, although the location of his memorial temple remains unknown. We know it existed because the various dismantled fragments of it were transferred across the Nile for reuse at Karnak, probably not long after his death. But the actual site remains obscure, and indeed it seems likely to me that it probably lies underneath one of the early 19th dynasty memorial temples, because a good site is unlikely to have been left virgin. So therefore, the chances of finding the foundations of Tutankhamun's temple are probably quite rather unlikely. But it would have been along the front somewhere along the line. And I've suggested in my recent book that it might actually lie under the site used by Ramesses II for his Ramesseum temple. But here we are going into the Valley of the Kings, where we find the tomb of Tutankhamun. The valley, as it stands today, has getting on for 70 tombs in it, of which 64 have got official numbers. Most of those which are visible in this photograph are from the Ramesside period, where the attempt to hide royal tombs had rather disappeared. However, prior to the Ramesside period, during the 18th dynasty, there was every attempt to make sure that tomb locations were completely obliterated after the interment. And this was achieved by placing them in locations where flash floods would be likely to pile debris over the entrances and make them completely inconspicuous, as well as difficult to dig out. And that's the reason why Tutankhamun's was found intact, because it was covered soon after the burial had taken place by thick layers of flood debris, which set solid. Then later kings, workmen had their huts built on top of that solidified layer, and then another flood envelop those as well. So the chance of any robber getting down to the tomb was pretty unlikely. Hence the reason why it was one of the tiny number of intact tombs found in the valley. Above the valley rears El Kern, pyramidal mountain, which Egyptologists have suggested might actually be intended to be a substitute for the built pyramid, which had been a feature of royal tombs until the end of the Second Intermediate period. It's at that point that kings give up. Well, in fact, it's directly after Ahmose I, who builds a pyramid at Abydos, that they give up on actually building pyramids. But there is a thought that the desire to have some kind of pyramidal structure, a figure, an image of the sun, above the tomb may have resulted in the choice of the Valley of the Kings as the place for the burial chambers of these kings. The valley is fairly congested. I say there's getting on for 70 tombs or beginnings of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, crisscrossing each other underground, with the long extended ones being those of the Ramesside period. Those of the 18th dynasty are rather more compact. And Tutankhamun's tomb is right in the centre of the valley, in fact, where a whole series of channels which carved out by floodwaters come together. As I say, that's the reason why the tomb was found intact in 1922. And here we have a photograph taken around the time of the discovery of the tomb. Here we see a modern wall built around it, and here is an excavation a bit further away, showing the sheer depth of the flood debris which are on top of the tomb. And anybody who's visited the tomb in the Valley of the Kings nowadays will note how far they've actually got to descend before they get to the first step of the entrance to the tomb. Now, in contrast to these extremely extensive tombs of earlier and later kings, Tutankhamun's tomb is extremely simple and contains only 4 principal chambers along with a descending corridor. And of these chambers, only one of them is decorated, the burial chamber. And it looks very much as though this was originally designed to be a private tomb, or at least the tomb of a minor member of the royal family, probably containing only what is now called the antechamber, which was then extended to accommodate the king's burial. And it's worthwhile noting, it's something which I'll be returning to, the fact that the floor level of the burial chamber is significantly below the level of the antechamber's floor. And this is because of a need for exceptional height for the chamber, which is something I will return to shortly. I say the tomb, just to compare that very simple form with the much more extensive kinds of plans of the tombs preceding Tutankhamun's, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, also that of Thutmose I and Hatshepsut, the earliest tomb, and then the bottom, Horemheb, Tutankhamun's second successor, whose tomb really provides the basic scheme for later royal tombs until the end of the New Kingdom. Now, your typical royal tomb of the earlier 18th dynasty has this basic layout of the burial chamber with a pillared outer part, and then a sunken crypt at the far end. And the reason for this, and the reason why we have this sunken crypt, which is equivalent to the sinking of the burial chamber of Tutankhamun, is the need to accommodate a series of wooden shrines above the sarcophagus, which we've got we've got sketched in to this one here. Now let's have a closer look at the tomb of Tutankhamun. Here we are in the burial chamber, the only decorated part, as I say. And here we find a mixture of things which are taken from earlier tombs, with some unique features as well. And in the centre, of course, we have the sarcophagus, with the outer coffin still in place when this photograph was taken, but the outer coffin has now been removed to the Grand Egyptian Museum, where the intent is that the whole of the funerary outfit will be on display. Then, just as part of our initial sort of tour of the tomb, this is the antechamber with the blocked doorway at the end here, with the burial chamber beyond that, these so-called guardian statues and these various other items, a couple of chests here, these beds, which at least symbolically were employed in the embalming process, and numbers of the thousands of objects which were found in the tomb. Then moving to the other end of the antechamber, more of these benches, various other items. Here, we've just on the right here, we have boxes for mummified meat. Here we've got dismantled chariots. And actually under this couch here is the entrance to one of the storerooms, which had been added to the tomb when it became a royal one. Anyway, so let's come back now to the burial chamber and have a look at what we can see here. Just what we've got here is part of the so-called Book of Amduat. Here we've got the king and his car embracing Osiris, and here we have got a goddess welcoming the king. So how does this scheme, and we'll get looking in the scheme in more detail, fit in with other tombs? Now, the Amduat, which is the book of what is in the underworld, is the earliest of the so-called underworld books. These are the principal decorative schemes for New Kingdom royal tombs, and they are all based to a greater or lesser degree on the nocturnal voyage of the sun god through the underworld. The sun god's descent into the underworld at sunset was regarded as being equivalent to death, and then his emergence from the underworld as the sunrise in the morning was regarded as being rebirth. So the whole of the nightly cycle of the sun was a metaphor for rebirth, and therefore a key part of the decoration, particularly of royal tombs during the 18th dynasty. So here we have the earliest fully preserved version of the Amduat in the tomb of Thutmose III, although a fragmentary example was present in the tomb of Hatshepsut. And so this is the principal decorative item right the way through to the last of the conventional royal tombs prior to Akhenaten. And this is it in WV22, which is the tomb of Amenhotep III. Basically the same scheme as in Thutmose III's tomb, except that Thutmose III's tomb has a cartouche form burial chamber, whereas Amenhotep III has a rectangular one. And here we just actually see the climax of the Amduat with the sun god in the form of Khepri at dawn, with the scary beetle pushing the new sun, the reborn sun, over the horizon. Now, the Book of Amduat has 12 hours, corresponding to 12 hours of the night. And here we just got a detail of it, with the sun god in his bark being pulled through the underworld, where he faces various trials and tribulations before successfully getting through and becoming the new sun. Now, this is the first hour. This is Amduat part 1. And in pre-Tutankhamun tombs, this is then followed by the full 12 hours. In Tutankhamun's tomb, however, we have a very, very heavily edited selection from it as being the only part of the Amduat present in the burial chamber. So these elements, these baboons, some of the attendants of the sun god, but not the sun god himself, and also the bark of Khepri, the new morning sun. These are the only elements of the Amduat which make it to Tutankhamun's tomb. And here we have it, the end wall of the burial chamber. So just hour 1, just this very, very beginning of hour 1. Presumably, this is because there is not enough space in this very small tomb to produce the rest. And the conception may have been that if you put the very beginning of the Amduat in the tomb, the rest of it will sort of magically generate itself right the way through to the end. And interestingly enough, actually Amenhotep III's tomb is the last time we have a complete contiguous copy of the Amduat. Although many later tombs have it all there, it's not all in the correct order. So there is clearly some rethinking about this sort of thing at the beginning of the post-Amarna period. And also, interestingly enough, in the next royal tomb to be built, that of Ai, we have again just the very beginning of the first hour, and then the rest of it presumably is generating itself. And here we actually have it in the tomb of Ai. Very slightly differently arranged, but the basic concept is the same, just this very, very beginning of it. Now then, moving on to the next wall. So we've just been looking at the left-hand wall here. We're going to jump over to the eastern wall, the eastern wall of it, because of course this is the west, which is appropriate for where the Amduat, the underworld, kicks off. And this is what we have on this wall, the east wall, which is the dragging of the royal catafalque to the tomb. This scene is utterly unique in any burial chamber, not just simply a royal one, but anywhere in Egypt. Now, the funerary procession is something which you might expect to find above ground in a tomb chapel of a private individual or the memorial temple of a king. But it's not something which has ever previously been found in a burial chamber, and actually will not be found in a burial chamber again. So we're already seeing not only have we got this heavily edited version of the Amduat, but we've also got a brand new innovation. And also what's interesting here is the fact that we've got the representation of all these members of the government. Again, something never found otherwise in a royal tomb. Burial chambers are normally all about representing what's going on in the underworld, not something which actually is linked with this world. And this little group is also interesting. We can probably identify most of the individuals. They're not named here, but we have some parallel scenes from private contexts which have this set, and we can identify a couple of them immediately. These two gentlemen with shaved heads are the two viziers, the northern and southern vizier, and there is somebody behind them who is closest to the king and therefore outranks even the vizier, and that this period can only be Horemheb, who was regent for Tutankhamun. And we can probably identify some of the others as well. There is this relief, which is from the contemporary high priest of Ptah at Memphis, and this is his funerary cortege. The people are facing the other way, but we have here the viziers once again, and the titles of all these people are above them, and the title of this one, the Iripat Emiromesha, is almost certainly Horemheb. So we can identify these people. And in fact, again, from what we know about the court of Tutankhamun, we can probably work back and work out who all these people are on the burial chamber wall. But say unique to have real living human beings on a burial chamber wall of a king. Then we move over to the south wall, part of which had to be broken away when to get to extract the royal funerary shrines. And in fact, this part on the left here, which was taken away in 1923, photographed and then lost, then apparently possibly found again in the tomb of Bey, stored there, and possibly then destroyed by the floods which wrecked Bey's tomb only sort of 10, 15 years ago. So it's possible that all that survives of this bit is the photographs. Then here on this wall we have Tutankhamun with Anubis and also the goddess of the West, who is a frequent figure in funerary representations. And here we are actually, once again, we've actually got something which actually does read across quite nicely from earlier tombs. In particular, the tomb of Amenhotep III, the last fully conventional royal tomb. And we've got here the goddess of the West and Anubis, the king once again, and the goddess of the West. Although we've got from in fact the tomb of Amenhotep III gives us most of the building blocks, if you like, for the decoration of the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. Although no pair of vignettes directly read across, and I think we find that with most royal tombs, that although you might expect there to be a lot of duplication, you get that, but there's always a degree of innovation involved. Egyptian artists don't slavishly follow the model. They will always add something of their own to it, and that's certainly true in these royal tombs as well. The north wall is the most fun of them because here we've got a mixture of tradition, and also we've got a completely unique scene once again. For the left-hand part of it, the king and his car embracing Osiris, and we've got this newt here greeting Tutankhamun. We've got some quite good parallels from the tomb of Amenhotep III. Here we've got Amenhotep with Osiris. Back here we've got Amenhotep with his car being greeted by Nut. Well, it's interesting here that in Tutankhamun's tomb, going back there, we've got the car and the king in the context of getting it before Osiris. Here it's before Nut, and here he's standing on his own. One thing that is really interesting, though, is the relationship between Osiris and the king, as shown here. Here with A3's representation, he's standing fairly stiffly while Osiris offers life to his nostrils. But if we then go to Tutankhamun's, you see they're actually embracing. And in fact, and as far as I'm aware, Tutankhamun's tomb is the only example where we have the king and the god actually physically touching each other in an embrace like this. So it's not found otherwise. So here we've got another nice little mixture of something which is taken from tradition, and also we mixed it in with something which is being manipulated for new. The completely unique thing here in the tomb is this scene of eye opening the mouth of Tutankhamun. And in fact, this is part of actually a clear sequence, because here we've got the funeral procession with the people who are dragging the catafalque here, going around the corner. The mummy has been offloaded and is now having its mouth opened. Now, the idea of the opening of the mouth in a royal tomb is found again in the 19th dynasty, not found earlier, but it's found later on. But the actual carrying out of the opening of the mouth by a named individual who is the new king is absolutely unique to this tomb of Tutankhamun. Probably it's to do with the fact that the succession is to some degree irregular, in that we've got a much older person, possibly even the maternal grandfather of Tutankhamun following on. And in that context, the carrying out of the burial by eye is the crucial legalistic basis for him succeeding Tutankhamun. And hence, probably the reason why it's put in the tomb here. Of course, this isn't very visible to anybody else, but the gods, at least by being in the tomb, it actually makes it the truth, at least as far as it's possible to have this sort of divine truth. But again, this is one of the elements of the burial chamber decoration, which is entirely unique. And just to show what I mean about the uniqueness of a formal person doing it. At the top there, we've got a typical private example of the 18th dynasty, tomb of Pat-Iri, Theban tomb 139, with an anonymous Setem priest carrying out the ceremony. And here at the bottom, we've got the tomb of Seti I, where we have the full sequence. But again, all the opening of the mouth is being carried out on a statue of the king, not his actual mummy. And in no case is the priest carrying out the ceremony the new king Ramesses II. It's simply an anonymous priest. And just here's a close-up view of one of the elements of the Seti I sequence. Now, the central part of the burial chamber is the sarcophagus, with 4 protective goddesses wrapped around the corners of it. In its exact form, the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun is absolutely unique, although as far as the basic theme is concerned, it fits in with the other royal sarcophagi of the latter part of the 18th dynasty. But these late 18th dynasty ones differ from what has come before, from the time of Thutmose III through to Amenhotep III. The royal sarcophagus was a cartouche form thing, with on the sides of it the 4 sons of Horus and 2 forms of Anubis in protective mode, with Isis and Nephthys on the head and the foot, and often with the pair of Wadjet eyes, which is something which is inherited from the prototypes of these sort of sarcophagi back in the Middle Kingdom. And here we've got the huge quartzite sarcophagus of Thutmose IV, where the number of deities has been further reinforced. However, Akhenaten stops using a cartouche form sarcophagus, unlike his father, and introduces a new rectangular form with divine women on the corners. Now, this is derived from the form of the canopic chest introduced by Amenhotep II, with the 4 protective goddesses around the corner. But of course, Akhenaten doesn't hold with these traditional deities, and therefore the 4 protective divine females on Akhenaten's sarcophagus are actually his wife Nefertiti. Nefertiti here having been elevated not only to being one of the most prominent queens of Egypt, but also actually the goddess of the dead as far as Akhenaten is concerned. And of course, the rest of the decoration is also greatly changed. No sign of the 4 sons of Horus, Anubis, or anybody else, but simply the embracing rays of the Aten. And Tutankhamun's sarcophagus is rectangular like that, but in its current form anyway, has the 4 protective goddesses who are further equipped with wings. However, it's clear that the sarcophagus as it stands today isn't how it was when it was originally commissioned, And Marianne Krauss, when she published the sarcophagus, was able to show the surface had been entirely reworked. Now, it's not quite clear what that original form was and whether the goddess, the figures on the corner, might even originally have been Queen Ankhesenamun, or Ankhesenpa'atn, as she was in the early phase of the reign. And also whether the rework was due to a rework for Tutankhamun, or whether he was usurping an earlier piece, for example, from the female king Neferuaten, many of whose funerary items were used for the burial of Tutankhamun. The other option, say, is the change was undertaken purely within Tutankhamun's time, and it's possible that if it was originally made with the Tutankhaten form of the cartouche, and then the royal name is changed to Tutankhamun, it would have been too obvious to simply try and just change the cartouches between forms, which may have resulted in a decision to completely rework the sarcophagus surface. This approach of corner goddesses continues under I and also under Horemheb. This is Horemheb's sarcophagus here. But then with the end of the 18th dynasty, there's a reversion to the old cartouche form, in the case of Ramesses I. Now, going into the sarcophagus, and sorry, I've managed to half cover the tag for the top one, which actually reads Inyatef VI. Basically, once you go inside the sarcophagus, we have the nest of coffins, and these are all of the so-called rishi form, which is the feathered form, which goes back all the way to the 17th dynasty. Now, for private individuals, this feathered form disappears early in the 18th dynasty, but for kings, the rishi feathered form continues right the way through until at least the time of Susenes I in the 21st dynasty. So from the point of view of coffins, the form for kings is unique. And that's also true for the cartouche form of the sarcophagus. There are other examples of this rishi form, the feathered form, on near contemporary coffins. This is the coffin of Thutmose III. Now, most of its surface was chiseled away during the late New Kingdom and the early 21st dynasty, when the royal mummies were both plundered by robbers, but also had the valuable elements reused officially as well. But although most of the surfaces has gone, there are patches where one can see that it originally was rishi and very much like the outer coffin of Tutankhamun. The middle coffin of Tutankhamun is also rishi, but differs from the outer one, which is just purely gilded, with being extensively inlaid with glass. A lot of books say this is semi-precious stones. No, it isn't. There's some small bits of semi-precious stones on the urae, but otherwise all the colour is glass, dark blue imitating lapis lazuli, light blue representing turquoise, and then dark red representing carnelian. And another view of it. Here we can see that the feathered pattern is now extremely stylized. And in fact, if you didn't actually know the origins and you could trace these coffins back to the 17th dynasty originals, which are very clearly feathered, you might not recognize the motif as that. And now we also have winged deities superposed on top of all that as well. But certainly it seems like the coffins are very, very much akin to what other kings prior and also post Tutankhamun had. And for a couple of close contemporary parallels at the top, there's a fragment of one of the coffins of Amenhotep III, found in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and the bottom is the coffin from the notorious burial KV 55. the nature of which has been much debated over the past century. For the record, I think the mummy inside is Menkaure, but there are colleagues who would argue that the mummy was Akhenaten. But the point is that the coffin is certainly of the same period and made originally for Kia, the junior and disgraced wife of Akhenaten, and then reused for a king. So, but there is a matter of some debate over which king. And then we have the innermost coffin of Tutankhamun made of solid gold. We can't be certain that other kings had solid gold in their coffins, but Tutankhamun had one. It's like the other ones did. And it's also rather interesting that such royal coffins as survive, the vast majority of them, all now stripped of their gilding, are middle or outer coffins, not inner coffins. The only inner coffin we have of a pharaoh of the New Kingdom is Ramesses III, and that has been carved from a single log of cedar at a time when things are getting less opulent. And here again with the inlay of glass. And then we go to the inside, to the mummy, with its various mummy trappings, and of course the famous solid gold mask. And we have parallels to that mask. We also have, say, the mummy trappings on the outside to actually make the mummy almost look like a coffin. The coffin and the mummy almost become simulacra of each other during the New Kingdom. But here we've got parallel masks, starting off with the very earliest known royal mummy mask, made of wood, originally gilded, but with the gilding all scraped off by robbers of King Hor of the 13th dynasty, Tutankhamun's, and then we have Susenes I's mask on the right, from actually the only genuinely intact royal tomb ever found, in the sense that Tutankhamun's had been penetrated by robbers to some degree, but Susenes' burial chamber was absolutely intact from the 21st dynasty. And then around the sarcophagi, we have the series of shrines, which I mentioned earlier on when I was talking about the reason for the greater depth of the burial chamber, to make space for that. Here's the outer one, covered with gold sheet with some inlaid faience. Inside that was a frame with a linen pall dotted with flowers, gilded flowers, and then inside that another shrine, another one inside that. So you've got a nest of 4 shrines. Now, these were something which Egyptologists had never found before, and they explained something which was a bit of a mystery for some time prior to this. Now, this is a plan of the burial chamber, showing the sarcophagus in the middle, and then with this series of shrines and also this pall frame around it. Now, this solved a bit of a mystery, because since the 19th century, Egyptologists had been scratching their heads over this. This is the plan, an ancient plan of the tomb of Ramesses IV of the 20th dynasty, and is a pretty accurate representation of the tomb. And it's quite useful because it actually tells us what some of the chambers were called, which gives us some better feel for how the Egyptians themselves visualized a royal tomb. But the thing people had scratched their heads over was that in the center of the burial chamber was the sarcophagus, recognizably the sarcophagus which we today can see in the tomb of Ramesses IV, but there were these strange rectangles around it. Then, with the discovered tomb of Tutankhamun, it was quite clear what they were, and even the distinction between the outer shrine here and then this rather more lightweight-looking thing, which is the framework for the pall. So, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was quite useful in the sense it illustrated what was being shown here in the Ramesses IV tomb plan. A piece which was not expected was the shrine, was also the shrine around the canopic chest. And this, as far as we can see, is unique to Tutankhamun, because no fragments of anything which, apart from possibly a few cobra heads, have ever been found in any other royal tomb, which would seem to come from that. No trace of any kind of figurine like this. So it looks as though this might actually have been an innovation of Tutankhamun's funerary outfit. This is the innermost canopic chest, the alabaster one, and also one of the 4 solid gold canopic coffinets, which held the individual bundles of viscera. This is interesting in that it was not made for Tutankhamun. It was originally made for Neferneferu Aten, the female pharaoh who probably was a co-regent of both Tutankhamun and also prior to that Akhenaten, and possibly even before that made for Smenkhare, another co-regent of Akhenaten. But leaving aside the question of the ownership, it clearly is made to sort of form a set with the second coffin. And this kind of arrangement for royal canopics is paralleled both before and after Tutankhamun. So here we've got the alabaster canopic chest of Amenhotep II, restored from fragments found in his tomb at the end of the 19th century, with also a fragmentary example of the stoppers in the shape of the heads of the king. We have no other New Kingdom examples of precious metal coffinets from inside. Not surprising, because these will be the things which have been hauled away and recycled very early on. And it's probably the reason that the robbers knew that these things were inside the canopic chests, is why they were smashed to smithereens to easily remove them. However, centuries later on, in the middle part of the 22nd dynasty, so we're now talking about the 9th century or so BC rather than the 14th century, when Tutankhamun was buried, we find King Shoshenq II here with a set of solid silver coffinets. So the tradition of precious metal coffinets for the canopic bundles was alive and well. Although it's certain that tradition was not unbroken, because Susenis I, for example, I've already mentioned, is utterly intact. He didn't have these in his with his canopics. Huge number of Shabti figures were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, ranging from really nice, what we might even call presentations. Indeed, some were actually presented by members of the royal court, along with more mass-produced ones. And as you can see here, there's a lot of variation amongst them. We have, and then others clearly from a different workshop working to a different concept. And here's just a few more from Harry Burton's original excavation photographs. Again, just to show the sheer variety of size and form of these. Now, when we look at earlier royal burials, we have don't have this. It's not until the reign of Amenhotep II we find this kind of very, very large variety. We have one example of a Shabti of Ahmose I, now in the British Museum. We have 2 surviving examples of Hatshepsut, and there's one of them on the right there. This is now in a museum in The Hague in the Netherlands. In fact, we have none for Thutmose III, which suggests that he just simply had 1 or 2 of them. But then for some reason, under Amenhotep II, we have an absolute explosion of numbers of Shabtis. And from here on inwards, we have burials of both private and royal individuals, sometimes with hundreds. I think the largest single number is over 1,000 for the later 25th dynasty king Taharqa. But here we've got a mixture of them. As you can see, again, there's mixtures of sizes and types, and there's even one which is made of black glass in the middle here. In fact, Amenhotep II's reign is rather interesting because it seems to be where a lot of things changed funerarily. The first canopic chest of the sort which Tutankhamun had was made for him. He also is the first king to have a sunken crypt in his burial chamber, presumably for the shrines. He's the first one to have all of these, this larger number of Shabti figures. So the reign of Amenhotep II is quite an important one in the evolution of the Egyptian royal burial. And just a few more examples, zooming into some of these ones of Amenhotep II, including this black glass one on the right here, which I'm including for my wife Diane, who many of you may be aware is a glass fiend. Something which is quite unusual is the fact there's actually a mummy mask over the head of this particular Shabti, and that's not something we find subsequently. Again, it all just shows that Amenhotep II's reign is one of significant innovation. And then we have some from the reign of Thutmose IV, including some which were placed in little miniature coffins. We have no examples of that from the tomb of Tutankhamun. So that's something which clearly dies out from the point of view of royal burials, although we have canopic Shabti coffins later on as well. And then the last, say, traditional burial before Tutankhamun, the Shabtis of Amenhotep III, which are, with one surviving, are pretty big things. The one on the left is a wooden one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is fairly chunky, and these great big granite ones. I think he's about the only one of the very few kings to have big granite Shabtis. Somebody else who had granite ones was actually Akhenaten, quite surprisingly, given that he basically throws, there's for other things, in his funerary outfit, he throws, it's completely new, but he does carry on the use of Shabtis. Clearly, these are so baked into what is part of a royal burial setup that he feels he can't abandon them. Other material, the so-called guardian statues found either side of the doorway. Whether these are intended as guardians per se or representations of the royal car is another matter, but they're ideally suited, and we find them here, and we also find examples in a number of later royal tombs. Unfortunately, we don't know precisely where they were placed in these later royal tombs because they've all been displaced by robbers. One wonders whether they might also have been placed either side of a doorway. And here are surviving examples of Horemheb on the left, Ramesses I in the middle, and there's actually two of Ramesses I surviving, and then we've got on the right there one of Ramesses IX. The fact we've got one going right to nearly the end of the use of the Valley of the Kings does rather suggest that this kind of guardian statue is a pretty standard thing, probably possibly going back prior to Tutankhamun, although no fragments survive of full-size ones like this. A few other little things. We've got all these boats in Tutankhamun's tomb, and we've got some very nice boats from other ones, particularly this one from the tomb of Amenhotep II. The black shrines, if we go back there, the various black shrines these boats are on all contain various gilded images of either the king or of deities. And just a couple of colour photographs of some of these. The one on the left being originally having been made for the female king Neferuaten, as we can see from the breasts on this one. As I say, a large chunk of the funerary equipment of Tutankhamun was derived from the unused burial set of Neferuaten. And looking at other tombs, we've got plenty of examples of fragments of this kind of figure. Here we've got the black felines, the sort we've got on the left there, from the tomb of Amenhotep II. Figures clearly which came from. So there's the sort of little spearing figure on the right there. we've got an example on the right here from, again, from Amenhotep II's tomb. The main difference between those in Amenhotep II's tomb and also others which were found in Thutmose III and Seti I and Ramesses I is that they're not gilded. Tutankhamun is the only king known to have gilded these little figures of kings and deities. We have also on the wall of one of the chambers of Seti II's tomb a set. These are painted yellow, so these are clearly gilded ones, but it's unclear why they're on the wall here. Everybody else, all the other examples of kings have real ones and no representations on the walls of the tombs. It's possible here that Seti II died soon after the end of a civil war, and there may not have been the resources available to produce a proper set, and therefore they ended up painting some of them on the walls. We have no idea behind that, but it's again interesting that the iconography of all these ones which are shown on the walls of Seti II's tomb of the later 19th dynasty are paralleled in Tutankhamun's set. And just going back to some of Tutankhamun's examples, and we can see that there's for example, we've got there's the figure of the harpooner and so on. So there's parallels of all of these. And then just looking at this set here, we can see these various deities on stands and so on. Here at the top left there, we've got the hawk, which is visible here on the left and right of Tutankhamun's set. And just some more examples that here going back to Thutmose III's time, we've got what appears to be one of these guardian statues, albeit these are much, much smaller scale, and then figures of she deities, Osiris here, so all of which are paralleled, albeit with gilded forms, into Tutankhamun's tomb. And just a few more examples from Amenhotep II's tomb, just illustrating that as far as this kind of thing is concerned, Tutankhamun is following standard practice, albeit rather more opulently by having them gilded. And then moving forward in time, we've got a couple of examples here, one on the left there from the tomb of Horemheb, and one on the right from the tomb of Seti I. Which includes some forms which you don't find earlier on. It seems as you move into the Ramesside period, we seem to get rather more bizarre forms of underworld deities and so on. There's particularly a disturbing one with a turtle instead of a head which is found in either the tomb of Ramesses I or Seti I. There's a degree of confusion as to exactly which comes from which. Then let's move to some other things. Chariots. Here we've got the dismantled chariots at one end of the antechamber, and a reassembled example of one of them, beautifully decorated with gold foil and also glass inlay. Chariots are something which are known either for real or for bits through the 18th dynasty. The chariot, introduced probably during the Hyksos Wars, became very much a status symbol, and we have examples both from private tombs and also from royal tombs. So here we've got the absolutely gorgeously conserved body of a chariot of Thutmose IV, now beautifully displayed in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization at Fustat. When it was in the Tahrir Museum, one hardly noticed it. Now properly cleaned and lit, it's an absolutely gorgeous thing. At the top right there, we've got the chariot belonging to Tutankhamun's paternal great-great-grandfather, Yuya. And here we've got the fragment of the boss of the wheel of one of those of Amenhotep III, now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So that has been a brief overview of some of the material in Tutankhamun's tomb and also the walls of it, trying to place the whole thing in context. One could say a lot more about many things. I haven't sort of covered the full range of objects which were found, but hopefully it just sets the tomb in context and demonstrates what's original and what isn't as far as Tutankhamun's tomb is concerned. Of course, its importance lies in its intact state, but also its placement at this juncture between the end of the revolutionary approaches of Akhenaten and through to the reinvention of many aspects of funerary art and broader religious art during the Ramesside period. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm happy to take questions as typed into the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I really appreciated that. We have a couple of questions to start, and of course, everybody, please do put your questions in the Q&A chat. Julia Trochet asks, do you think the depiction of eye as part of the opening of the mouth, opening the mouth, speaks at all to the timing of when that was painted?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the decoration of the tomb is carried out pretty soon, very, very late on, just before the introduction of some of the funerary equipment. And indeed, it looks as though the back wall is decorated with that opening of the mouth scene, probably just before they put the shrines around the sarcophagus. And indeed, the other walls seem to be decorated after the shrines are in place. So this is very much of the moment, painted probably only sort of hours after I might have carried out that very action. So this is in real time, I think.
Wow, that's awesome. Another one. Sarah Orell asks, you mentioned that there was a significant change of royal burial customs. What was it about his reign that might have led to this in the reign of Amenhotep II?
We don't honestly know. One can make various sort of suggestions, I suppose. I think the point is that Amenhotep II is the first reign after sort of almost new kingdom has been fully set up by his father, Thutmose III. I get the feeling, one gets the feeling that the experimental era of which probably runs from Ahmose I's victory over the Hyksos and all that, and Hatshepsut's reign, that's all. They've worked through various things, and A2 is when you've probably got the Egyptian empire, if you want to call it that, and everything else set up. So it's probably a time is ripe for rethinking stuff. It's also rather interesting is that Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and Amenhotep III seem to have shared an architect of the royal tomb. This is Ka, whose tomb was found intact at Deir el-Medina by Schiaparelli. That's Theban tomb 8. And it does appear that the Ka serves from A2 right through to A3, and they're very similar tombs. And as one does wonder whether it's something to do with Ka, when he comes in as the new overseer of works at Deir el-Medina, he sort of has ideas, and that is what sort of is what comes out in that. Because the other thing is that the cartouche form burial chamber is dropped in favor of a rectangular one with that crypt and so on. So all of that does suggest somebody has rethought it. And I do wonder whether Ka is the man who does all that.
Huh. Okay. Another one from Julia Trochet. In the images of the statues coming from the black shrines, there's a figure that seems to be holding a man up on his head. There was also another one of those in the tomb that you showed right after that on the wall.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think it might be Ihi. It's a child god who is sort of being held up there. I can't honestly I'd have to look it up exactly who he is, but I think it's Ihi, I think.
Huh. Yeah, because I'd never seen it before either, or at least I wasn't familiar with it.
Yeah, I think
Um,
I think the examples I'm most familiar with are indeed the ones from from Tutankhamun's tomb and the Seti the second one. Yeah.
okay, thank you. I have a question well, I'm just going to take over. So KV62 pretty much intact. Why do you think, and this is a real big umbrella question. KV46 was also almost pretty much intact. In fact, we get that chariot, right? It's like the first intact chariot that we find. Why do you think, I would love to know your thoughts on why do you think 62 was so much bigger than 46? Like in terms of the public attention and all of that kind of stuff.
But it's a pharaoh. I think that's the difference. That Yuya and Chuyu, they did get a lot of publicity before the First World War. Unfortunately, they were then sort of displaced by their great grandson, great grandson, their descendant anyway. In all of that, as I say, a pharaoh will always trump a general.
Yeah.
That's part of it, and of course, there's so much more stuff in Tutankhamun's tomb. I think if you sort of look at the sort of the media back in when Yuya and Chuyu were found, they're pretty, they're pretty high up there. However, when Tutankhamun, a pharaoh will also always trump a royal in-law kind of thing. And also, I think that the time was also sort of quite right. It's worthwhile bearing in mind that at the same time that Tutankhamun's tomb is discovered is when the bust of Nefertiti is first shown publicly. Also, it's when the Egypt Exploration Society is kicking off its work at Amarna and being quite sort of out there with it. So I think there's sort of the early 20s is that the zeitgeist is perfect for it to explode in the way it did. But the thing is, people like gold. When you're talking about solid gold coffins, masks, and so on, it's a feeding frenzy around it.
Yeah.
That's what I think is quite nice is that Yuya and Chuyu got kicked out of their gallery in the Cairo Museum to make way for Tut, and now Tut has been moved to Nemek, and they've got their gallery back.
They have their original gallery back.
I think that was a gallery they were in at one point anyway. They've been moved around the museum a few times. They've now got a decent gallery, and I think it was actually the gallery they were originally in.
Huh. That's amazing. Okay. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. More questions. We'll ask these last few for you. There's 4 more. Hopefully they're not too difficult. First one from anonymous attendee. Do you follow the belief that I took the tomb of Tut and put Tut in the tomb where he was found?
I think it's not. I think it's a reasonable suggestion. And you can't prove it one way, but that tomb is absolutely bang on for a very senior official. And in fact, the tomb is almost identical in size and form to Yuya and Chuyu. So it looks like, and it seems to make eminent sense that somebody who no longer needs their tomb because he's just become a pharaoh does a swap with Tutankhamun. I think that's certainly my working hypothesis. I think.
Okay. I love these hypotheses. I think they're all great. Another one from Joe Davidson says, when the replica exhibit came through Kansas City, there were hieroglyphs everywhere, but there doesn't seem to be any translations of these texts. What are standard funerary texts? Is there a possibility that there are unique passages given how many objects are distinct to this tomb?
All the texts have been published in transcription. There's a big volume by Muhammad Salah and Horst Beinlich, which every single text has been transcribed. They are all, and then some of them have been published in detail. The ones from the shrines, for example, were done by Alexandra Piankov and Rambova back in the 50s.
Wow.
Some of them are unique in the sense there aren't examples earlier than them, but then we find them on into the Ramesside period. Like the shrines, for example, include some compositions which then turn up on the walls of Seti the First tomb and some of the other Ramessides. So I don't think there's a very few which are substantive ones. I'm sure there must be some which aren't quite you don't quite find quite the same thing elsewhere. But as I say, there does seem to be a rethink when the Amarna revolution is put down, if it is sort of it ends. You know, one is often sort of told that things went back to normal after Amarna. It didn't. There are radical rethinking. So when in my subtitle of one of my books, I called it the Egyptian Counter-Reformation, in the same way that the Catholic Church's reaction to Protestantism wasn't just to sort of it was to actually try and to defend things a different way. So, and for example, and certainly that's true in the royal tombs. Prior to Amarna, it's all Amduat. Afterwards, we have Amduat with Book of Gates. They start inventing lots of other ones. Private tomb chapels, the daily life scenes disappear completely from the chapels in favor of much more sort of theologically based ones. So there is a real rethinking. And I think when you look at the tombs, particularly of Tutankhamun and of I think we're seeing that process of what are we doing here? Rethinking things. Because everything's been thrown up in the air by Akhenaten, they're able to go in and think, well, how can we do things a bit differently? So therefore, in Tutankhamun's burial chamber, bring a scene which has never been previously or subsequently seen in a burial chamber down the funeral procession with real people in it. You don't never had that before. And then the I having his that tableau, and then in the tomb of I, for example, you've got a hunting and fowling in the marshes scene on the wall, which has never been found in any burial chamber ever before. Although that scene is common in tomb chapels of private individuals and also in memorial temples. There's an example of that in the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. So they're playing tunes, you're going for sort of reduced forms of the Amduat and stuff. And then that under Horemheb, probably then more under Seti I, then becomes the new normal.
Amazing. Okay, last one, and then we will give you a break. From Sandy Assini, in one of the images, there was a couple of Ushabti that looked purple. Do you happen to know what material they were made from?
I think the ones you're thinking of are actually made of gold, but with quite a considerable amount of iron in the gold. Oh. There's a purple gold, which is it's unclear, it's unclear whether or not this is simply an impurity which over the centuries has turned it purple, or whether or not it's been done on purpose. And one can never be quite certain about these things. Yeah. In favour of it being accidental is that on a couple of the shrines, some of the gold is proper gold coloured, and some of it's purple. And I can't believe they really wanted intended to be sort of a patchwork, which suggests that some of the gold, when it was being refined and sort of alloyed, got a bit of iron oxide in it, which was okay for a while, and then after a few centuries, thousands of years, it went purple. So we're unclear whether some of these playing with these sort of coloured golds are intentional coloured golds, or whether or not it's an impurity which only became apparent long after the tomb had been closed.
Thank you. Can I just say that one of my favorite things about, for example, your talk is there's so many things, like you were talking about KV55. You said you think it's Menkaure, other people think it's Akhenaten, some people think it's Neferuaten. I love that there's evidence to back up each of those, and that we just kind of all not all, but like we can make our own assumptions, and then we can go from there. And yeah, anyway, thank you so much.
I think the key thing is that I think as Egyptologists, we must always say to people, these are our working hypotheses.
Yeah.
We should never try and claim that anything we say is the truth, unless it is something which is absolute. There is no other option, and there's solid scientific and textual things. The vast majority of this stuff there isn't. So I think we must be all be very sort of self-aware that we are dealing with our working hypotheses, which can actually change. And say some of mine have changed radically, and sometimes just one discovery will make that radical change. So yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I actually have one question before we wrap up. In the various places where we see the 4 protective goddesses around the corners with their wings outstretched, I noticed that they are obscuring text. So do you have any comments or anything about that issue? And is that something we see in other places? Because I don't remember having seen that. Really, it kind of struck me.
It is an interesting thing, this whole question about things which are hidden behind. I think there was a paper at ARCE which sort of talked about some talked about this. And I was talking to somebody in the margins about a couple of places. This is something which is rather unusual. I think it's you only seem to find it in the New Kingdom. And again, I do wonder whether this is something to do with this sort of very innovative, open kind of attitudes we seem to have artistically. The things which sort of, it seems to be a time when people are prepared to try stuff, which isn't really the case. You don't really seem to find it in Ramesside times. And yes, this idea of things possibly covering, although actually the wings, the text do actually continue to the other side. It hadn't actually hidden a chunk of the text, although it looks optically looks very much
interesting.
So it does just simply carry on. But yeah, if you couldn't actually read the text, you'd think some of the text was hidden underneath the wings. It isn't. It just carries on. But the impression is, and there are a few things where there are figures who are partly covered over. For example, on the Thutmose IV chariot, a figure of a god is partly concealed by the king. This is my discovery. This was chatting with somebody at the ARCE meeting this last weekend. So it just shows how important these kind of gatherings are, from being able to get this kind of information.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to second Kate and everyone's appreciation for your talk tonight. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you very, very much. And we have just one further slide to show everyone. We just want to thank everyone for their support of our programming and our chapter for this year, as this is the final event of our 2022-2023 season. So stay tuned, because we will have a new lineup of activities and lectures and workshops for fall of 2023. We'll take a little bit of a hiatus over the summer. So thank you all very much, and I hope to see you next season. Everyone have a lovely summer.
Bye.
Thank you.